Before I introduce our great panel of speakers, who I'm really grateful for them and them volunteering their time, I thought I'd just give a quick overview on kind of legal PR and comms for those that do know and those that don't. So many of you will know that in 1986, laws on the legal sector advertising were relaxed, which meant that for the first time, law firms were able to gain greater visibility in the marketplace, and therefore meant that law firms could think more and more about PR. And I think this is particularly interesting because there are lawyers who had been at their law firms for decades who suddenly could promote themselves. And this was a tricky situation to navigate. The door to legal communications opened even further in 2007 when a new suite of new legislation was brought about by the Legal Services Act, which meant that law firms for the first time could float on the stock market, and that there was an emergence of alternative business structures that led to increased competition across the board. All of these changes, coupled with the globalization of law firms, their clients, as well as their kind of many cross-jurisdiction mergers and alliances in the years, changed the nature of the legal industry and the race, and it just showed that there was a lot more competition. Similarly, we've seen over the last couple of years, the Big Four's presence continue to press on the perimeter of the legal sector, and it basically has led to law firms kind of needing to invest more in innovation, incubators, and legal tech solutions, which in turn means that law firms have had to promote themselves and publicize themselves a lot more. This, coupled with kind of the millennial generation who care a lot more about companies, law firms, and their kind of reputations and what they stand for, means that many law firms have had to demonstrate positive actions on things like behavioral ethics, diversity and inclusion, and kind of ethics and principles. And so obviously law firms have had to do a lot of comms around that, but it's not just PR, it's also now involving a lot of digital, social media, and content. And penultimately, while all of this is positive, law firms have also had to deal with internal or external exposure to the firms, and have had to deal with many crises and issues, which I'm sure our esteemed panel can talk about in greater detail. So enough from me, and I'm very privileged to introduce my panel, who have about 50 years of experience working in legal comms, PR, marketing, and recruitment in total. If I can start with my ex-colleague Sonia Malhotra-Denny, who is a PR manager at Clifford Chance. Sonia has over 12 years of experience in professional services communications and started her career at Kyson PR. After that, she has also worked at Taylor Wessing, Simmons & Simmons, and worked for a number of agencies advising companies such as Coca-Cola, Asda, and Boots. She's been at Clifford Chance for over 6 years and heads up comms for the technology, corporate, litigation, HR, and diversity and inclusion practice areas. Also, interestingly, for a comms professional, she has a master's degree in journalism. Second, and interestingly, Barney O'Kelly is the UK marketing director at AlixPartners, not a law firm. He spent 11 years working in the defense industry with BAE Systems, and after that, he moved to Freshfields Bruckhaus Deringer in 2012 and set up the firm's dedicated digital marketing team. After some time there, he also took responsibility for the whole communications team. He is currently, as I mentioned, the managing director at AlixPartner, marketing director at AlixPartners in the UK, where he joined in 2020. Thirdly, we have Rebecca Ellis, who is a director at Totem, the recruitment consultancy. She has operational responsibilities across Totem's divisions, including marketing and business development, HR and finance, having joined the firm in 2010. And she also maintains a recruitment consultant role within the marketing and BD team, focusing on manager to head of levels. And she's also been in the legal sector for approximately 15 years. And then last but not least, we have Cho Chan Ho, who is an account director at Byfield Consultancy. She works with a full spectrum of law firms and legal business clients, from boutiques to global law brands. She leads her account team to drive effective multi-channel communication strategies for clients, and her expertise spans traditional media relations and marketing activities. So thank you all for joining, and thank you to our panel. So my first question to you all, and I suppose starting with Sonia, and to you all, is how did you get into the wider field of legal and PR comms?
Hi there, everyone, and thank you, Adel, for the introduction and also the background to the context of the legal PR industry. I thought that was really interesting to be reminded of. For me, the journey into legal PR is probably quite similar to a lot of people who end up in legal PR media, in that I didn't know it existed when I first started 12 years ago. And as going back to what Adel said about the changes, it really was in its infancy when I was starting to look for my first role. So I did my master's in journalism. I wanted to be a journalist, if not a financial PR. And I'd looked at all of the big heavyweight, the financial PR, and looked for live roles around the time that my master's was ending. And Kaizen PR, which specialised in professional services and legal services, offered me a 2-week paid internship. And I don't know if you remember, 2 weeks paid in PR is like gold dust. So you know, I jumped at the chance to work with them for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks there, they offered me a full-time role. 2 weeks turned into 2 years. And then I moved in-house with Taylor Weston. So I really fell into it thinking that I would go into financial PR because that was all I knew. And actually, I'm very, very pleased that that's where the path took me.
Thanks, Sonia. And Barney, you obviously differing career path. What took you from defence to law?
A happy accident. No, so I'd been at BAE for about 11 years, and I felt I was running the risk of becoming an expert in BAE rather than an expert in the technical discipline of comms and marketing, or disciplines. And Freshfields was looking for a head of digital. They'd never had one before. It was 2012, so timescale wise, that's about right for when lots of law firms started to wake up to this stuff properly. And I saw it as a quite interesting change program. I completely underestimated the level of change. I thought I was going from one place that was filled with blokes in suits to another place that was filled with blokes in suits, and that was largely correct, but the culture was very different, and all the things I'd become accustomed to in a PLC weren't there in a law firm. So I'd studied law, decided quite early on I wanted nothing more to do with it as a profession, and then several years later ended up working in one of the world's sort of most well-known and oldest law firms. And then I stayed there for 6.5 very interesting, very challenging and very fulfilling years.
Thanks, Barney. And Rebecca, obviously you offer us something different as well. Obviously the recruitment side and helping to find law firms and candidates and guiding people. What, of all the industries in the world, what brought you to law?
What brought me to law? Oh my goodness, by accident, really, to be honest. I started my career in the legal sector at Chambers and Partners. And for those of you on the call who know, probably the Chambers and Partners have a directory, a leading directory, open to discussion, the value of that. But anyway, then 20 years ago, it was seen to be very important. And I worked there in recruitment and fell into legal marketing recruitment there. And I've stayed in it. I love the sector. It's a really interesting and changing environment all the time.
Thank you so much. And then last but not least, Cho.
Unmute. Thanks everyone for joining this evening. In comparison to my fellow panelists, I've had a very short career in PR so far, but as Sonia mentioned, it was a happy accident that I fell into legal PR because I read law at university. And after I graduated, I was looking for something that was, you know, connected to the law, but not the solicitor or barrister route. And I stumbled across Byfield Consultancy, where I am now, and did an internship and decided I liked what I had gained some experience in, and I've stayed, and ever since, the rest is history, as they say.
That's great. So it sounds like half of our panelists have legal backgrounds in their degrees and half of them don't. So it shows that you don't necessarily need a legal background to do legal PR. So aside from your academics, I suppose open to the panel, and please do jump in. What particular skills and attributes do you think anyone wanting to go into legal comms needs in order to be successful, both, I suppose, at an entry level, but also the further up you go?
Adel, I can have a go at answering that. For me, it's really important to remember that this is a media job. So a bit like Barney was mentioning, it's great to be good at your sector or your firm, but don't forget that you work in media. So I think one of the most important skills is actually to just have an interest in media, read the papers, listen to the podcast, listen to the Today programme when you wake up, have an interest, follow journalists on Twitter, because when you work for a firm like Clifford Chance, for example, it's so much more relevant for you to understand the world of big business than it is for you to understand the world of law. And it's better for you to know what decisions Vodafone or Spotify or Coca-Cola are making than it is for you to know what announcement a small regional firm is making. So don't forget that this is a media role, and if you really want to succeed in it, it's so advantageous if you can actually have a genuine interest in media. If you're the kind of person who wakes up, the first thing you do is check BBC News, read the papers, and don't just read the headlines, but actually read the articles. If you're that kind of person, then I really think the world's your oyster in PR. It's a really good start. There are lots of other skills that you can gain, but an interest in media, and not forgetting that this is a media-facing, for most firms, role, is, for me, what I always look for in candidates.
I agree, Sonia. We've seen some, over the years of recruiting legal PR roles, we've seen law firms predominantly wanted candidates from other law firms that do PR roles, because they understand, how law firms work and the nuances of professional partnerships. They understood the legal press. And I think that's still the case to an extent with some firms, but there is more of a shift in the last few years to hiring people from outside of the legal profession. So people who've worked in the Big Four or financial services, people who've worked in agencies is a big area in terms of candidates moving across, who've managed clients outside law firms, but outside of law firms as well, into professional and financial services, because it's that broader understanding of media and also sectors rather than it just being legal specific.
Thanks so much. Barney?
Well, I agree with both Rebecca and Sonia. I also think one of the things that I found, I mentioned earlier, that was missing is you don't have the same levers to pull in a law firm. Right, like if you work in a listed company, there are rules about things that you say and things that you don't say, and that can be quite helpful, particularly for managing sort of aberrant behaviour. But in law firms, a lot of it comes down to your influencing skills. You've got to be able to persuade, cajole, seduce people into often doing things they don't want to have to do, and it's very difficult to really, bring the rules in a lot of the time. So I found it quite exciting, actually. It makes them quite an interesting place to play. And I use the word play very deliberately. Like, you can build really good rapport with some people, and some people you just can't. You can go where people really want to do new and interesting things, and you can leave people who'd rather be more conservative to be more conservative on their own terms. But I think that influencing skills side of things, that I would say is probably the skill set I developed most in the time I was at Freshfields.
Definitely. Cho?
Just picking up on something that Rebecca said towards the end about, understanding different industries. I think Sonia's quite right in that, you've got to be a news hound, really enjoy, keeping up with what's happening day to day, following themes and, topics of the day. But I think what we find in legal PR is often, people say that they're an expert in the legal industry, but lawyers obviously operate within their clients' worlds, be it, financial services, corporate, one day, I think when we were having a chat about it before, Sonia says, she was doing private equity and then she has to switch to litigation. And there's a lot of variety. So you've definitely got to be up for a challenge, go into this career path, you've got to be a generalist as well. You've got to be able to touch on different topics, change it up. And if you're up for that challenge, it's a very fulfilling career. You're always learning. You know, when you're speaking to lawyers and partners, they can be very exacting and precise individuals, but at the same time, you know, they're experts in their areas of law. So, you know, if you want a job where you can apply the law, understand, you know, keep up to date, and also, you know, work with the media and do something a little bit different, you know, work on content one day, or maybe do a bit of digital social. There's a lot of variety in the role. And yeah, you know, I think you've got to be up for a challenge. I think you've got to be tenacious and you've got to be hardworking. Does anyone want to disagree?
No, I definitely agree with that. And it is, I think that's what I like coming from a PR agency to a law firm, that it is that variety that it does give you, and you are managing kind of different accounts per se, and you are being kept on your toes. So no, I totally agree with everything that you've mentioned. You've all mentioned, obviously, working with lawyers is interesting. How would you say it's different working with lawyers who own the business, you could say, than working in a PLC or in a charity?
I'm happy to go first.
Thanks,
it's an interesting dynamic in law firms. You know, there's a certain degree of embarrassment about the fact that the partners own the business sometimes, because obviously you report on how much money they make. It's one of the few metrics they do, and I know Sonia's got an interesting perspective on this from the prep call, in terms of how that's made the PR profession within the sector quite interesting. But it's all a bit British and embarrassing. It certainly was at places like Freshfields, as you know, that the person sitting in the office next to you owns the company, or owns part of the company, I suppose, for a period of time, given that Freshfields is nearly 300 years old. But yeah, I mean, look, it's like anywhere, right? You've got those people who have a very set view of how the world is, usually established over their experiences over quite a long career. In a lot of law firms, people have never worked anywhere else, particularly at partner level, so they don't really have a sense of what life is like elsewhere, which when I was doing a digital role was quite interesting, because sort of the internet was delivered unto them when Freshfields got the internet, and similar, you know, so that's a technology currency sort of level. But then there are some of them that are just brilliant, like truly brilliant people, really smart, really charismatic, do some incredible work. And you can do some really interesting things with them. It's the variety and the level that personality plays in life in a law firm, and how that creates a culture, make them really fascinating places to work, really distinctly challenging places to work. And they're not for everybody. Like, you often see a lot of people come in from outside of the sector who just can't understand how law firms are successful. And you normally have to go, despite themselves is usually the answer, but they manage to be incredibly successful.
I'd agree. Barney, interestingly, when we meet candidates sometimes who have left the legal world and then want to come back. So they'll say to us, do you know what? I've had enough of law firms. I want to do something different. I want to change a different environment. And then 12 months later, they get in touch and say, actually, we're quite interested in coming back into a law firm. And it's that level of intellect that they sometimes miss in other organisations. It's the level of the intellect of the individuals and the topics, the conversations that they're having that they miss, which I think is quite interesting, actually.
Yeah, I vowed I would never work in a law firm ever again when I left. I was like, one and done, that's enough for me. And then when I was running my own business, after about 6 months or so, I gravitated back to law firms, because once you've figured out how they work, that is a marketable skill set.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. I can see the appeal. I don't know if I'm quite in that camp yet. I've found a slightly more comfortable home in management consultancy, which has a lot of the same quirks. But I can completely understand it. I never thought I would. I thought I want to get as far away as humanly possible. But professional services generally is an interesting place to play if you like it.
I think the other thing I would add, just from my point of view, when we're meeting candidates, is beyond the relationship skills that we've talked about and the stakeholder management, is I think it's really important to have kind of a high intellect but low ego in these roles. I don't know whether you'd agree you do them, but I think, you know, people in some industries, maybe that may not be the case in the same way that it is in the legal sector, and that sort of humility.
I have one comment, and I'm going to shut up because I've talked too much. But I think to a degree, I would agree, Rebecca. The one thing I found quite interesting when I first joined Freshfields is people say the partners here are so brilliant. They can do our jobs. And my view was, no, they can't. That's why I'm here. And professional respect cuts both ways.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes where people have struggled in law firms or where they've become heavily institutionalized, the reason they think the partners can do their jobs is because they keep bloody well asking them to. You know, you have to direct and lead and have an opinion, and you'll have a much more productive and enjoyable career than if you just become a functionary, which is easy to do if you play in the wrong places and adopt the wrong approach, which is, what do you think I should do next? You're paid to figure that out. So yeah, I think a degree of ego. I mean, I have to say that.
Yeah.
Colossal, but
yeah. I didn't mean not having that. You have to have a bit of a core of steel about you. You don't need to be the professional and push back. But it is with a low ego.
Yeah, I would totally agree actually with what both of you are saying. I think law firms present a unique structure where you are working with owners of the business, and that can be really motivating in so many ways, but it can also create challenges where you're asked to be doing things, and if you do become a yes man or woman too quickly, that's really detrimental to not only the firm but to your career and to the practice and that partner themselves. So I would definitely say that you need a degree of backing yourself and becoming a trusted advisor. Don't be someone who just delivers. Actually give guidance, give advice, and be an expert, and that's how you can build those relationships. And then you can really position yourself nicely within management where they can see the value of engaging with you, and you're not just going to do exactly what you say. You're not going to be replaced by a computer or somebody more junior. You're actually advising strategically at a really high level. And some lawyers are more challenging. I think that's for sure. But I also think one of the key skills to be in any comms role is that you have to be able to communicate with people that you get on really well with, and maybe people that you don't see eye to eye with. And when you work for a firm like Clifford Chance, certainly you are also getting the same calls from media, from the Daily Star. I mean, they're not running again anymore, but from the Daily Mail or some of those tabloids. And you have to have, it's not like you're always going to deal with people that are easy. I think you definitely need to be prepared for the fact that there are going to be some challenging people. But when it's internal and when it's your clients, as long as you're really clear with what your professional boundaries are as well in terms of credibility, that's a really valuable thing, because I can go to a partner and say, I won't push that out. And the reason I won't do that is because not only will, if I start pushing out low value stories to high profile journalists, will they stop reading my emails? That means that when another partner asks me to do something, or when we're discussing how to build profile on something that is more valuable and more impactful, I've lost that relationship with that journalist. So it's definitely set your own credibility boundaries and stick to them, and don't be afraid to communicate them to your stakeholders, because they need to understand that you represent the firm and so many people, and you can't ever jeopardize one relationship for another. And I think that's a really important part of managing lots of clients and lots of different people.
Thanks, Sonia. I think, Cho, you probably have a good idea of that too, working with different law firms, and obviously not just the lawyers, but their in-house teams.
Yeah, so I was going to say, just offering a different perspective as I'm agency side. What Sonia says is true. You know, you've got to balance the interest of the individuals, and because partners own the business, you know, they're running their own kind of book of clients. They've got their own objectives. They want to build, you know, business development leads in specific areas. But I think when you're agency side and you work on core client accounts, you've obviously got your marketing or comms contact and team that you work with closely to ensure that you're you know, addressing the brief that's been set to you, but also making sure that, you know, your efforts across the board are balanced across the different practice areas, and also the firm-wide piece. And I think you know, it's a juggling act sometimes. There's always going to be, you know, maybe one partner or a practice area that really wants to, you know, push on their practice, and you've got to say sometimes, oh, okay, actually, you know, I've got to balance that against another 3 or 4 different areas, and you know, you just adjust. I mean, an important part of the role when you're in communications and PR is, relationship building. And I think, when you've got a good foundation and you've got regular communication between you and your client, there's nothing that can't be, discussed. And, you just have to balance the pressure and say, actually, at the same time, if it doesn't feel right, or you would advise they do something differently, you've got to speak up and say it. They value you more, sure.
Definitely, totally agree. And apologies, I should have mentioned that if you do have a question, please do put it either in the Q&A box or put your hand up and we'll come to you. An anonymous attendee has put in a question to our panelists. The question is, do law firms as a business fully appreciate the value of PR? How should PR professionals be demonstrating their value to the partners and business as a whole? Great. Barney, I can see you've gone off mute. Would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, I just need to get up to my pulpit. I have a sermon on this one. I think it's been quite interesting. I think the last few years for law firms have been quite a learning experience around some of this stuff. I mean, I think there were those that got it anyway. They understood the value of it at very simplistic level sometimes, in terms of, everyone needs to know about the work that I've done 2 or 3 weeks after I've done it. But I think some of the more chastening experience they've had reputationally over the last few years have really made them focus on not just using the word reputation casually, but thinking about what it really, really means. I've always found law firms talk a lot about reputation and culture, and they used to do that in quite a facile way sometimes. They're both really, really important. They're fundamental to why you would choose one over the other, but they didn't really give them the attention they deserved. And then you started to see some of the things happening in the press, various different issues that they really needed to get serious about, and they needed to have a position on, and they needed to take a position that wasn't one of equivocation. It was, this is what we stand for, and this is what we mean, and this is what we'll tolerate, and this is what we won't. So I think that's really, really helped. The only thing that's always never ceases to amaze me is how people who work in professional services, and Sonia made me think of this in her comments earlier, this needs to go on the front page of the FT. Have you ever read the FT? Right? Nothing like this ever goes on the front page of the FT. There's a weird naivety there that they almost forget aspects of it, and you come back with the same sort of questions time and time again. But I think broadly, the value of PR, the job that gifted professionals do on behalf of that organization has really come home to roost in the last few years, is my, as something of a sort of offhand observer rather than being right in the crucible.
I would completely agree, Barney, actually. I think the last few years have been transformative for the industry. And one thing that might be worth mentioning is we've also seen a rise in terms of career trajectory, where we've seen not just one or two, but a good few really competent PR professionals move up to board level positions within law firms, move up into management level positions. And that's been really, really good. It's really motivating. It's exactly where the industry needs to go. So there isn't that glass ceiling where you can't be a partner anymore. We've seen PRs become partners in law firms, and that's been a real shift. So I think that's worth mentioning. So that's on the positive side. But I will be completely honest, I've worked with a lot of different law firms. I've been very lucky to work in-house in places where PR has always been valued, but I have a lot of friends within the industry and it's not universal. And I would really say to any candidate looking at firms, and Rebecca, you'll probably hate me for saying this, but do interrogate the position of PR within that law firm. Interrogate that job spec. What are you being asked to do? Are they things that a PR expert will add value to those processes? And if they're not, that will give you an indication of actually what your role is going to be. Look above you and see where have the people who have worked as business professionals or within brand communications and marketing, where have they ended up? What level are they operating at? Are they on the executive leadership board? Are they on the board? Do they have a seat at that table? And that will give you a good indication of actually whether that firm values PR or if it doesn't. So you definitely have to do in any industry which is where PR or media is fairly new compared to banks, or like going back to the history that Adel mentioned, where it is in its infancy in terms of age. You also have to do that groundwork, ask around, look at the structures, and do that research for yourself. But if you can find the right place, know that actually we do now thankfully live in a world where we can move up to the same trajectory as a lawyer can, and we are being respected in the businesses. So it can be a really fulfilling and a really long career, but just not everywhere. So just worth bearing that in mind.
Thanks, Sonia. Rebecca, do you want to retort to Sonia's comment? And also, are we seeing more expenditure and kind of those PR, comms and marketing roles in law firms than we might have been doing before?
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you, Sonia. Any candidate that's looking at a role, you've really got to interrogate that, because the roles are very different as well, aren't they? Some are, you know, it depends on the team around you. So PR and communications roles can mean different things to different organisations. And, you know, are the directories part of that? Are there, how does it work with a campaigns team? Is there a campaigns team? You know, where's your content going? Because that's really important. It's not just about media relations. And there's been a huge shift in roles in terms of campaigns and content roles that we've seen, and the play that PR, you know, you guys have in those roles. And you're absolutely right. You know, there are firms now where they have joint a BD director and a marketing communications director who both report into COOs and are the same level, which is amazing. And then other firms have, you know, one person that covers everything. So it's really important to understand. It's also important to understand the way that these roles are viewed in terms of, so when candidates interviewing, looking at it from another point of view, some candidates, if they don't show how they understand how PR impacts and communications impacts the business and joins the dots up around that they're not transactional roles, but they'll fail at interview if they don't understand the impact that these roles, your roles, have on a business, and how critical they are. So I agree with what Sonia said completely. Massive change.
Thanks. And Cheryl, I suppose from your side, how do you show your value as a consultant to the law firms and show them that they should obviously engage in you and widen their horizons, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I mean, you know, I agree with what everyone else has said. I think the question about what is the value of PR is asked often. How do you measure it is also another one that's asked often. And I think when your agency side, I think it's slightly different in that, you know, and I've had some clients tell me, you know, if it comes from you, sometimes it's better, because actually the partners will, you know, take stock and maybe approach it a different way. I think some firms are more advanced. They've done it for longer, and they know what it's about. There are firms that you work with who are completely new to it, doing it for the first time, and they're kind of like doing it because everyone else is doing it. It's, you know, they're going through the motions, but, you know, they're not sold into it. I mean, when we talk about comms and PR, it's such a broad range of different skills and different ways of talking to your stakeholders. I think increasingly, you know, when you come into legal PR, what you do need to be able to show is when you're, you know, coming into a job role, is that you're a diverse candidate, in that, you know, you're not just able to do the traditional media relations, you can actually engage, you know, that social media is such a big part of it now, that, you know, you're tapped into those conversations. You know, if something's happening, you know, in the news that day, you know, big piece of legislation, actually, what's the conversation on social media about it? How are people interacting? What's the sentiment? And then when you're advising your client on how to interact with that, you know, it all, you know, there's an element of it, or, you know, kind of joining back up. And yeah, there's no, I don't know if I can answer, do law firms fully appreciate the value of PR? I think it's yes and no, depending on which law firm you talk to, and it's our roles as legal PRs to show them the value in the day-to-day work. And I think it's that reputation point that Barney made earlier on. You know, at the end of the day, we're here to protect the reputation of the firm, to help them grow. And sometimes you can't measure that. It's a bigger piece in the puzzle. So I don't know if I quite answered your question, but I've tried.
Thank you. No, definitely. I think I agree with that. And I think working on the agency side and in-house, the lawyers and the managers of the law firms like to see the business impact. So if you can show them kind of this piece of PR or this campaign led to more conversations with clients and the doors opening, or obviously attracting more talented individuals, then that's obviously great for them. But I appreciate that's hard to show all of those steps. Thank you everyone for your questions so far. Potentially for Sonia and Cho again. Great discussion so far. What are the main differences for doing PR for mid-tier firms and Magic Circle law firms? I suppose, how far does the name go? And is that ever a kind of, is it harder to do PR for smaller firms, I suppose?
I personally, I've worked for firms like Taylor Wessing and Simmons, and I've worked for Clifford Chance, and when I was an agency, Freshfields were a client. So from my perspective, it's not harder, it's just different. It's different skills, it's different challenges. Both can be really, really fulfilling. When I was at some of the smaller firms, it was much more about, there was a lot of graft needed. You were really pitching, you were explaining, you couldn't call up and say, I'm calling from, even big firms like Taylor Wessing, which are great firms, great reputation. You did have to explain what they were. We're a law firm, we're an international, we specialize in X. So there was a different level of, in terms of having to deliver and build that profile. And that was really interesting. And I really enjoyed that. I'm somebody who likes picking up the phone. I like speaking to journalists. I like sort of being in the hub of it. So that was really, really great. When you work for a firm like Clifford Chance, you get a huge amount of incoming inquiries. And every time any firm makes a big decision, you're the firm that, well, us and Freshfields and some of the bigger firms, that the legal press or even some of the business press will turn to say, are you going to follow? And it's a really strong indication of where the business world is going. So for example, if Volvo increases their paternity leave to 24 weeks, we might get a call and say, oh, we've seen another huge business increase their paternity leave. What's yours? What do you offer your staff or your employees? And that's a change. When we were at smaller law firms, you wouldn't be impacted so much by what every other business was, the decisions that every other business was making. As a firm like Clifford Chance, you do, because you're not necessarily just a big player within the legal industry, you're just a big player. You are big business. And so when any other big business makes big significant pledge or commitment or change, you're going to be the next person in line, or one of the people that they're going to call to see, will you follow? And I think that level of interest of every aspect of your business, and COVID has really accelerated that and intensified it, because so many firms have reacted so differently to COVID that we've had every time someone says, oh, we're opening the office for 3 days a week, they're like, Clifford Chance, this firm completely unrelated to you is doing this, what are you doing? And you don't get that so much in a smaller firm, so it's slightly different. And actually, to answer one of the other questions which is linked to this, someone asked a question about marketing and whether the main difference between, do firms understand marketing and the difference between marketing and PR. And I actually, at Taylor Wessing and some of the other firms, they did have very distinct roles, but a lot of the smaller firms understandably do bring those roles together. They bring events or marketing, and Rebecca can talk about this too. And in those firms, PR is very different. Whereas when you're in a firm like Clifford Chance, you have the infrastructure to have experts within your areas. So my team is an expert in media and PR. This is what we do basically day in, day out. We really understand the media environment. We understand big business. Then you also have our marketing team, and they are so good, and they are absolutely top of their game in terms of marketing. We have a digital team who are hugely impressive, and they understand social media like no one else does. So we have all those disciplines, and we have experts at the top of their fields within them. At smaller firms, you have amazing business managers who can do lots of different things. So not to be disparaging on them, it's huge multitasking, lots of different skills, but not necessarily so honed in that you are an expert in one field. So when I talk about, if you want to come to a firm like Clifford Chance and work in the PR team, you need to understand media. That might be less of an emphasis if you were in a smaller firm where you were doing a bit of media, a bit of marketing, a bit of internal comms, some events, some other things.
I think to Sonia's point, I agree. Sonia's told me off many times when I tried to volunteer and help others in other teams, and she'll be like, no, your focus is media. They've got experts in these sections. So if you want to do media relations, go to Sonia. Yeah. Rebecca and Barney, obviously you've got significant experience in this sector. Any thoughts, Barney? Maybe particularly as you joined, obviously, Freshfields and worked in many roles in their team, and obviously there's a bit of overlap between the media and the digital, and did everyone understand your different roles?
Well, I think Sonia makes a really interesting point around the way that teams are composed, and Rebecca mentioned this earlier, that no two firms seem to have their comms, marketing and BD set up quite the same. You know, it's merciful relief that you don't always have to report to a BD director these days. Even more merciful that you don't have to report to an HR director. I think the composition of the teams is really important. The one thing I was always nervous of was having too many silos. And it's a horrible word, it gets used a lot, but you know, no, that they do that, but that's fine. Having those centers of excellence and expertise is fine, as long as they communicate with each other. So what I tried to do with the comms team at Freshfields is pull it all together. I wanted to have what looked, to all intents and purposes, like the corporate comms team I had become used to in a FTSE 100 company. Now, whether or not I was successful, I don't know. I think they've dismantled it since I left, so probably not is the answer. But it gave us a coherent collection of compatible capabilities, if I can be any more alliterative, that meant that trying to get them to work together was easier, rather than these guys sitting over here and these guys sitting over there and all that kind of stuff. The one thing, I've never worked in a mid-sized firm. I've worked with mid-sized firms though, and what's different is the legal press. Well, that's a big difference, I think. When you're a Magic Circle firm, there's a lot of interest in what you do, not just in your sort of gender pay gap, not just in which partner's moving to which US firm, you know, what brand of toilet paper you have, all of these kinds of things. They attract a level of interest that sometimes I think mid-level firms will be quite grateful to get that amount of attention, because, you know, it's coverage. But the thing is the good coverage never counts for anything. It's only the bad coverage that ever has to be dealt with. You know, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I found that a fascinating curiosity of the sector. There's too many legal titles. I think that's a reflection of the profession's self-regard a bit, but they make a lot of work for a lot of people. And when we were talking about measurement earlier, when I took over the PR team for the first time, they didn't measure any of the work they did with the legal trades. And I was like, this is taking 70% of your time. You should be measuring it in some capacity, because otherwise you're only accounting for 30% of your time. So you know, there is different in places. The level of attention is different. I think Sonia's point around being part of the bigger business conversation is not one I'd considered, actually. And it's fascinating. And particularly this year, I think it's become a real kind of, you know, part of the conversation.
Thanks, Barney. Rebecca.
I think I mean it's fascinating, really, because I think particularly early on in your career, there is obviously the differences between which you've outlined completely around the different size firms, but early on in your career, you know, to have a role, unless you know exactly where you want to be, sometimes it's quite interesting to work in a slightly smaller organisation, in the right organisation with the right support around you, so that you do get experience across the different areas of marketing and PR, because then you can sort of work out where maybe you want to specialise, or maybe you want to continue in that broader role. And interestingly, the more then on the other side of it, the more senior you become, when you become the marketing director, typically you have overall responsibility for all of the areas, including PR. So it's quite interesting. So you know how those components all work together and how they fit. I think a lot of firms, and you guys will tell me if what you think of this, but some of the larger firms particularly struggle with, as Barney said, the silo piece, and particularly then linking that into business development and client development, because sometimes there can be, you know, the teams become very siloed when it goes from marketing, communications and BD, and yet the conversation has to happen across all of those areas, because you have to be involved in all of the conversations and know what's happening. And so to my earlier point, there's somebody who can join those dots up is really important. So even if you're sitting in a media relations team in a big firm, if you know you've had a couple of conversations which link together, which the BD team might not know about, it's about playing that into that team. And I think some directors are challenged by that, making sure that it works consistently across those big firms, and actually have looked at putting campaign managers or other people in that can help pull all of it together, so that those silos don't exist. So yeah, it's the roles do vary quite significantly, I think, from firm to firm, although on the tin may be called similar things.
Thanks so much. We have another question also, and this is slightly related to different law firms, etc. So the question is, what are your thoughts on the increase of US law firms to the UK legal PR market, both from a PR perspective and also from a recruitment perspective? I suppose, Rebecca, we can start with you from the recruitment perspective and then move back to PR.
From a sorry, could you repeat the question? Sorry, I didn't quite understand it.
Of course, sorry. What are your thoughts on the increase of US law firms in the UK legal PR market from a recruitment and PR aspect?
Okay, well, from a recruitment perspective, I guess it not necessarily directly related to PR. I mean, we've seen an increase in roles in the US law firms in London, definitely smaller US law firms that have grown, you know, and are growing very, very quickly, are bringing more people into the sort of law firm management roles in London and Europe. And they are becoming they're becoming more standalone. So whereas, you know, many years ago, it used to be, okay, we'll do what the US said, but we'll write it in a way that the Europeans understand, or the people in London understand, or whatever it might be. They've now become more standalone businesses, and therefore, you know, have sort of more leadership here and increase the teams. So I think there's good opportunity for people in US law firms that perhaps before they might be working across a real breadth of a role that was very broad, rather, where they probably were paid quite a lot of money but didn't have the level of autonomy and authority that they now do. So I think, you know, depending on the firm, it can be a good environment to work. I'm sure if that answers the question, but
no, definitely did. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Cho, Sonia, given you're close to it at present?
I've never worked for a US law firm, so I can't really comment in terms of what it's like on the ground. But one thing that I have noticed from my peer network is that they tend, exactly as Rob said, and this is definitely changing. It's definitely becoming more, if I can use the word, sophisticated in terms of PR, but it has traditionally been a comms person that has done a lot of different things. So even though you're working for a firm that might be really big in terms of size, your comms function is pretty small. And where we talk about advisory against somebody who does delivery, it has tended to be more on the delivery side of the job rather than the advisory side. So I actually think for somebody at a certain level in your career where you're really keen to build relationships with journalists and you're pushing out content, there's some really fulfilling roles. One thing that I really enjoy, one part of my job that I really enjoy, is actually looking at the media environment, bringing that in, advising at a really senior level. And I don't know that in all law firms, let alone just US firms, that happens within the PR functions. But I certainly feel like the people that I know that are in US firms, there are a few roles that actually really offer that seat. But that's just my kind of view on it. There's some great US firms, and they're doing some really interesting things. We never used to see US law firms coming out with, for example, inclusion announcements 5 years ago in the way that they are now. So you can see that they've moved away from just the client work and let's talk about PE or let's talk about M&A to talking about what it means to be a business operating in the UK. And that's a really nice development to see. And I think it shows that they are actually, that playing field is starting to level up. So it's definitely one to watch over the next couple of years. But you know, I've had mixed experiences from my own network.
Thank you so much. Oh, so an interesting question, actually. And to I suppose, a couple of interesting questions. One of the questions there, we've got quite a fair few questions. One of the questions is, do you think it would be challenging for people from outside the UK to build a career in PR at legal firms in London? What would help kind of expats succeed in that situation? Obviously, visa issues aside, if you don't know the UK market or law firms, what's your, I suppose, opportunities? there. And another question, I'll just group them together, is Barney, specifically for you. How does Barney analyze the amount of work versus the result that goes into media relations with legal titles? I.e., what kind of data have you ever collected, etc., and how do you know they are in a good or bad place with the legal press?
Do you want me to answer that now?
Yes. You said, obviously, to clarity, you said that the legal press require a lot of work, but not necessarily enough results.
Thankfully, these days I don't have to. It's a simple answer. I would say it came down to a broader conversation and understanding of measuring the impact of what we were doing across the board, which as a profession PR has struggled with quite often. You know, more things have been discredited than accepted in terms of viable PR measurement. You know, AVE has gone the way of the dodo, thankfully, NNI similarly, all of those kinds of things. So what I actually did at Freshfields is I stopped a lot of the measurement because it wasn't answering any of the questions that the partners wanted answered or that I wanted answers. So how does this help? So what we tended to do was focus on what was the business outcome. You know, so take recruitment. How many graduates do you need to recruit this year? X number. Did you recruit that number? Were they of the right caliber? Were they of the right diversity? Yes. In that case, the comms was at least enabling that, not hindering it. The legal press bit, it's a big distraction in every sense of the word. It takes a lot of time. I'm sure Sonia will agree with this. It can take a lot of time, particularly around, you know, when your accounts are put onto Companies House and they're never quite the same as your other accounts because there's lots of interesting peculiarities in the way that law firms report their numbers, and you know, ambitious young reporters who want to build a career and move on and follow Caroline Binham and Tabby Kinder into the world of the FT and all of those kinds of things. I think basically there's a hygiene factor employed, right? So you don't really measure it. You've just got to do it. It goes with the job, right? It takes a lot of time, find an efficient way to do it, a bit like the directories. And if this was about directories, we could go off in a number of different directions, but it's a factor of life in a law firm. It needs to be done, do it efficiently, build good relationships with those journalists for as long as they're in those roles, usually about 2 to 3 years, get to know the editors. They can actually be really useful people to know. You know, to dismiss them just as trade press is naive. They're a really useful part of the industry, but measuring the impact on what it means for a Freshfields or so on, it's quite tricky. Was my assessment of it. So I'm kind of grateful I don't have to answer that question properly anymore. I mean, Sonia probably could give me a better answer because she's in the industry. Not wanting to set you up there, Sonia, but you know, it's hard. It's just one of those things you have to do.
And similarly to Cho as well. Sonia?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I actually would agree with everything Ben said. It's really hard, and I think you can spend a lot of time measuring in a way that really isn't the right way and isn't adding value and isn't driving the right conversations. So it's very similar to Barney. Understand the firm's strategy, make sure that all your comms is aligned to that strategy, and then it's helping the firm move in that direction, and you're doing a good job. And if you can ensure that that's what's happening, that the content you're producing is all in line with the growth areas or the areas that you can make most impact, then you know that you're acting and you're working in a strategic way. So that's really important. And when somebody asked about not being based in the UK but wanting personally, for a firm like Clifford Chance, a very global firm, I don't think it really matters if you've never worked in the UK before. The last person that we hired when I took my first maternity cover had never worked in the UK. She'd worked for global firms, not in the legal industry, but in private equity, and she came in and did a fantastic job, and she learned it on the job. So I don't see that. I would never have that as a worry when I was hiring somebody. They need to have an interest in learning about the UK market. They can do all of that research, they can learn it, but much more important are the other skills that we've talked about. So I certainly don't let that put you off if you're based somewhere else. If you're looking for global firms, they will be looking at you. Actually some of the advantages of having that global insight, of understanding how media works in your jurisdiction and having that international news lens, could be a real asset to you. So don't let it put you off, actually use it to your advantage.
Thanks, Sonia. Rebecca, anything to add to that point?
I'd completely agree with Sonia actually on that. I think the only thing I would say is that it's probably easier for that individual to find a role in a bigger organisation, to Sonia's point, a global organisation, but a big organisation with a wider team. Because I think if you're in a standalone role, you may be up against candidates as well in the market that have got experience in the London market, and also you'll have responsibility for that area with no wider team to support you. So in terms of if you go to a bigger organisation with a much bigger team, then you'll have an opportunity to utilise the experience you've got really, really well, and also continue to learn and have that support around you. So that would be the sort of focus of the search, I would suggest.
Thanks so much, and hopefully that was helpful. Conscious it's 6 o'clock, so I'll ask one final question from our panel, and it's a tech one. Is automation a risk that would put some of us out of work in this industry? Anyone? Well, go on, Bunny.
I mean, I think there's so much judgment and interpersonal relationships that go into that. There, like any job, there are aspects of it that can be automated, probably should be automated. But no, I don't think so. I mean, you know, if nothing else, there's that particular word that law firms love so much, which is nuance, which is basically a euphemism for just being particular and esoteric, but it's hard to automate nuance. So I think if you are a good advisor, capable of thinking strategically, can think of the context in which an organization is operating, think of the personalities involved in the decision-making process around an issue or how something happens, then there is work to be done for many, many years to come. If you churn out press releases every single day, then yes, your job probably should be automated, is how I put it.
Thanks, Barney. Joe.
Yeah, I agree with Barney. I think it's the same conversation around could you automate, the delivery of legal advice to some level if it's a pretty straightforward and there's not a high level of thinking involved. Probably yes, there are some elements of the job that you could automate quite easily. But I think when we talk about comms and PR, we often think it's quite a proactive job in seeking out media relations, and a large part of our role as well is reputation management and mitigation of risk. And I think there are these conversations, when you're talking to journalists or clients, where there's judgment involved, where there's a balance, and if you're standing there as a human saying, oh, is it this way or is it that, or maybe it's actually something a bit nuanced than that, how can you expect a robot to kind of take that job from you? So that's a different way of looking from it. Hopefully though, tech's not going to take over the world, because I still like to have a job in a couple of years' time. And I think it's going to be part of the natural development of the world, that yes, there are going to be bits that you can streamline, reporting back to stakeholders, that kind of thing. But when it comes to the advisory part of our job, I would say no.
Thanks so much. And Sonia, if there's anything you'd like to add?
I'm going to say exactly the same as everyone else, but just to add that automation can be your friend as well. Look at it and see what you can use automation for. How can you use it to make you a stronger PR professional, media professional, comms professional? Can you use it to collate data and make more strategic decisions when you're advising? So if you're choosing where to put resources, can you use automation and some of the really forward-thinking tools like Signal to actually collate information that can help drive conversations at a strategic level internally? And I think that's really valuable. You're always going to need both, but actually automation and some of the new technologies, they will be really helpful if they can be used in the right sense, and they can also allow some breathing space for people to have more fulfilling careers where they're not just doing the churn. So definitely look at them as opportunities, not as risks, and focus on all of the things that Barney and Chair have said, which is just adding value at every stage. Never just send a piece of coverage. Explain, why is that coverage good? Is it the positioning? Is it the share of voice? What is good about this piece of coverage over anything else? And I think the more you can train yourself to do that, to never just do something that a Google alert can do, the better that you'll be.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. I'm conscious of time. And thank you everyone for your time and joining in and your questions as well. I think our head of our PRCA Legal, Richard Gerard, did want to say a few words about the PRCA for a minute or two, if he's still on the line.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just trying to turn on my video. Hi, everybody, and thanks very much. Can I just say, I thought that was a really fantastic discussion. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you, Adel, for chairing it so ably, and also for putting it together in the first place. I think that's one of the best sessions we've had for a while. Look, just a few words about the PRCA before we kind of semi-socialize or whatever we do in these new virtual environments. We're the biggest professional PR and comms body in the world. We've got 35,000 members in 70 countries. We run a sort of professional charter and code of conduct. So we're about standards, but we're also about training, we're also about networking. And the PRCA in the UK also promotes and has essentially run the ICCO, which is an international association of 41 PR associations around the world, involving about 3,000 agencies. So it's a big organization. We've got about 500 in-house teams in the UK who are signed up. And watch out for our survey, which is coming out shortly, which is collecting a lot of information about the profession, which you'll want to feed into. Just to let you know that your in-house teams can join for between 1,000 and 5,000, depending on your budget. But don't worry, you can join as individuals as well for £150 plus VAT. So it's worth knowing. The legal group has existed for 3.5 years. And when I took this on 18 months ago, we had a lot of ideas about all the fantastic meetings we were going to have. And they've all been like this, unfortunately. They've all been Zooms. And there's been no opportunity to get together face to face. We hope that will be changing soon. You know, I'm not going to say words like irreversible and all of the rest of it, but we do anticipate actually being able to go out and meet one another pretty soon. The PRCA groups are all encouraged to hold an event, which is a real life event before the end of the year. And we do have the intention of having a party. So we're hoping that we're going to have a really fantastic event in which we can remind ourselves of our humanity and remind ourselves what socializing is once again. So do watch out for that. It's going to be a fantastic thing. So thanks once again to everybody on the panel for all of that. I hope it's encouraged you all to pursue your careers in legal PR. And now, hopefully, over to the next phase of this event, which is networking and socializing, which I'm also looking forward to. Thank you.